Chapter 1. The Invisible Keeper. The bronze clock showed 6:47. Serafina pressed her thumb against the hem of the gown, feeling the unfamiliar silk slip beneath her fingers. The pale blue fabric had come from a colleague at the archives. Eliza, who possessed both the dress and the confidence to wear it to functions Serafina had only read about in society columns. The dress fit well enough, though the bodice sat slightly looser than intended. She'd pinned her dark red hair back with 3 small combs, a style Nessa had taught her years ago, and still she felt like a child playing dress-up. Marcus will be there, he confirmed. She'd received his note 3 days ago, written in careful script on cream-colored paper. I shall be waiting at Colère at 7, a table by the window. I want you to see the city lights, Sarah. He'd remembered she loved the city at night. She'd shown him once, pointing out the tower spires from the archive steps, and he'd laughed and called her a romantic. 7. She had 13 minutes. The photograph of her mother watched from the nightstand, Elspeth Harker in her factory days, before the years had worn lines into her face, before she'd worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. Serafina had inherited her mother's stubborn hope, the kind that kept getting up after being knocked down, the kind that kept accepting invitations from men who might not show. Not this time. Marcus is different. She didn't believe it entirely, but she rehearsed the words anyway, adding them to the small talk she'd been memorizing all week. The archives have been busy. I read the most remarkable account of the Thorn Hollow fires. Have you visited the northern quarter? The baker there makes honey cakes. A knock at the door, 3 sharp raps. Nessa stood in the hallway, her dark hair tucked beneath a practical wool cap, her clerk's coat buttoned against the evening chill. She took one look at Serafina and smiled, though something flickered behind her eyes, concern maybe, or the particular wariness that came from watching a friend walk toward potential hurt. You look lovely, Nessa said, stepping inside. That blue suits you. It's Eliza's. It fits like it was made for you. She tilted her head, studying Serafina's face. You're nervous. I'm not. You checked the clock 4 times while I was standing out there. Serafina's mouth twitched. It's a nice clock. Nessa laughed, the sound warm in the small apartment. She crossed to Serafina and adjusted a pin that had begun to slip. Men like Marcus always seem too easy at first, Sarah. Keep your heart close tonight. He's been kind. I'm not saying he isn't. Nessa's voice softened. I'm saying you've been hurt before, by men who seemed kind. Just watch yourself, yes? Serafina nodded, though she wanted to argue, wanted to insist that this time would be different. She took a breath instead, letting the borrowed silk settle around her shoulders. They left the apartment together, stepping onto cobblestones still warm from the day's sun. The evening had cooled, and lamplighters were making their rounds, sparking flames in the glass sconces that lined the streets. Colère sat 6 blocks east, a district Serafina rarely visited, where the buildings wore stone facades and the windows glowed with candlelight. They walked in comfortable silence, Serafina's low heels clicking against the stone. Through a shop window she caught her reflection, a woman in a pale blue gown, dark hair pinned carefully, trying to fit into a world that had never made room for her. The silk caught the lamplight, turning her into someone else, someone who belonged in restaurants like Colère, who didn't flinch when men made promises. She looked away before the image could settle. 7 o'clock, a table by the window. They turned onto the main avenue, and Colère came into view, a white facade, tables visible through tall windows, the murmur of conversation spilling onto the street. Serafina's heart beat faster. She was almost there. The maître greeted her with a slight bow, his expression flickering with quick assessment, her dress, her face, the absence of company. He led her to a small table near a stone pillar, tucked against the wall where diners could pretend she wasn't there. Any preferences for wine? Miss Water is fine. She didn't trust her voice to order more. He left the menu and a glass of water, his attention already drifting toward the next guest. Serafina sat rigid, her hands folded in her lap, and watched the door. 7:15. The clock on the far wall chimed softly. She'd waited before. This was nothing new. Men were busy, men lost track of time. Marcus had been thoughtful, remembering her love of city lights. He'd confirmed that any moment now. 7:30. Around her, the restaurant hummed with easy conversation. Couples leaned toward each other, laughing at shared jokes. Groups of aristocrats spoke in low, cultured tones, their jewelry catching candlelight. A woman in emerald silk glanced at Serafina, then looked away, dismissed. The pale blue dress that had felt like a disguise now felt like a target. 7:45. Mistress. A server approached, sympathy threading their voice. Would you care to order? No. Serafina's throat tightened. I'm waiting for someone. The server nodded and retreated. Serafina checked the door again and again, each glance carved a little deeper into something she'd spent years building walls against. He's not coming. Her father's face surfaced unbidden the day he'd walked out, the suitcase in his hand, her mother's silence afterward, the pattern of men who promised and departed. Marcus had seemed different. He'd remembered things, laughed at her jokes, written her notes on cream paper. 8:15. The clock chimed. She'd been a fool. Again. The shame burned hot in her chest, spreading to her face. She could feel eyes on her, though. When she looked up, no one was watching. They didn't need to. Everyone knew. The woman in the blue dress, waiting alone, still believing. She pushed back her chair. She would leave with dignity, walk home, and never speak of this, never speak of him. A shadow fell across her table. She looked up. A man stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark wool trimmed with silver. His hair fell across his brow and his eyes caught the candlelight, gold-flecked and steady. He moved like someone accustomed to rooms making space for him, an ease that spoke of absolute authority. He sat down across from her without invitation. His loss. His voice was low, certain. Mine, perhaps, if you'll allow me to salvage your evening. Serafina's first instinct was to refuse. The disparity between them radiated from his tailored coat, from the easy authority in his voice, from the way the other diners had noticed him, a current of recognition passing through the room like a held breath. I don't require charity, sir, nor am I offering it. He signaled the server with barely a gesture. Wine, the 38 Reserve. His eyes returned to her, unwavering. I asked your name, not out of courtesy, out of curiosity. The server departed. Serafina sat rigid, her hands still folded in her lap, her pulse loud in her ears. Serafina. The word came out clipped. Serafina Harker? Serafina. He repeated it like he was tasting it. You were waiting for someone who clearly lacks the wit to appreciate what he missed. Her jaw tightened. You don't know anything about me, only what I've observed. He leaned back as the wine arrived, watching the server pour. You wore that dress like armor. You've checked the door 11 times in the last 20 minutes, and when you decided to leave, you were more angry at yourself than at him. She stared at him. No one read her this easily. No one had ever tried. What do you do? She asked, defensive. Read people for a living. Something like that. A ghost of a smile. Tell me about your work. You mentioned archives, I think? Or did I imagine that? She hadn't mentioned anything. But something in his attention made her speak anyway, against every instinct that screamed at her to leave, to protect herself, to stop being a fool again. I work in the public archives, document preservation, mostly mundane land deeds, trade records, census rolls. She paused, but sometimes there's something worth saving. Letters, journals, a woman's account of the Great Flood, written while she was waist deep in water trying to save her children. And you believe those stories matter. They're the only things that do. The words came out fiercer than she intended. Power shifts. Kings rise and fall. But a single voice, preserved, that's eternal. That's the only truth that survives. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you call it? The disciplined clerical archivist, though most people call me a keeper of dead things. She shrugged, the old embarrassment familiar. It's not glamorous. Glamour is overrated. He lifted his glass to the keepers then, the invisible ones who hold the world's memory. She didn't touch her wine. You're wealthy. Aristocratic, clearly. Why are you sitting with me? Because you're the most interesting person in this room and everyone in it is too busy performing to notice. He said it simply, without flourish. Also, I suspect the maître d' seated you by the pillar to hide you. I've been wanting to thank him for the error in judgment. Despite herself, something loosened in her chest. The meal arrived. They ate. Conversation flowed, halting at first, then easier, then surprisingly free. He asked about the fire 3 years ago that had damaged the Western archives. She told him about the manuscripts she'd salvaged, smoke-stained and brittle, the ones she'd spent months restoring. He asked what she believed made a story worth preserving. Truth, she said. Not facts, truth. Anyone can record what happened. Stories show what it meant. He nodded slowly. Most rulers would benefit from understanding that difference. Midway through the evening, his hand moved across the table. His fingers brushed hers, brief, deliberate, a question rather than a claim. She didn't pull away. The contact was warm, steadying, like a promise made without words. When the plates cleared, he rose. He placed a card beside her plate, cream-colored, simple, embossed with a crown above a single name, Damon Blackwood. Beneath it, in dark ink, his handwriting, his loss, mine. He left without waiting for response, his presence lingering in the space he vacated. The restaurant exhaled around her, conversations resuming, the spell breaking. Serafina sat motionless, the card trembling in her fingers. The names struck her like cold water. Damon Blackwood, the Alpha King. She looked up, but he was gone, swept into the night, into a carriage that rolled away from the curb, leaving her alone with the weight of what had just happened. Her, a common archivist, and the ruler of the Seven Territories had just offered her his hand across a table and left his name like a calling card. The candle on her table guttered. Outside, the city lights blurred through the window, same as they'd been an hour ago, when she'd sat waiting for a man who never came. Everything else had changed. The archive smelled the same as always, paper dust and aged leather, the faint sweetness of rot-fighting cedar. Serafina breathed it in like a lifeline as she pushed through the heavy oak doors, her satchel pressed against her side. The main cataloging room stretched before her, rows of shelves climbing toward windows that let in thin, dusty light. She'd spent half her life in this room. The familiar creak of floorboards, the soft shuffle of turning pages, these were the sounds of safety. Nessa stood by the periodical shelves, a stack of documents tucked against her chest. Her eyes found Sarafina immediately. Something flickered there, shock, then urgency. Sarafina crossed to her desk, setting down her satchel. The wood was worn smooth from years of her elbows, her hands, her solitary lunches eaten between cataloging sessions. Sarah. Nessa's voice came out strangled. She dropped her documents on a nearby cart and grabbed Sarafina's arm, pulling her toward the corner by the fire suppression alcove. Sarah, do you know who you sat with last night? The cold that had been sitting in Sarafina's stomach since she'd read the name on the card crystallized. I know, the maitre d' has been asking questions. Asking about you. Nessa's grip tightened. They're saying you were dining with Damon Blackwood, the king. They say he sat with you for 3 hours. The words landed like stones in still water, rippling outward into everything Sarafina thought she understood about the previous evening. Not a rescue, not chance, a deliberate act from the most powerful man in the Seven Territories. She sank against the wall, her shoulder blade pressing into cold stone. This is wrong, she whispered. This is... He was just... I didn't ask for anything. I know. Nessa's anger softened into something more like fear. But the court gossip mill doesn't care what you asked for, they're already talking. Sarafina closed her eyes. She could feel the weight of invisible attention already pressing against her skin, the way she'd walked into the archives this morning and noticed the junior clerk staring, the way the morning light suddenly seemed too bright on her borrowed dress. This will not last. The voice came from somewhere deep, some buried chamber she'd thought sealed. You will be found inadequate. You will be left. Her father had said he would come back. He'd said it the morning he walked out the door, his suitcase clicking against the threshold. Just a short trip, he'd promised, just business. She'd waited by the window for 3 days. Sarah. Nessa's hand found hers, squeezed hard. Whatever happens, I'm here, but you need to decide what you want. Before the court decides for you. Serafina nodded, not trusting her voice. She spent the next 4 hours bent over a manuscript repair, her hands steady even as her thoughts spiraled. Smoke damage from the fire 3 years ago, the same fire that had destroyed half the Western collection. She worked the adhesive along the fragile edge, pressed the fragment into place, repeated. The rhythm soothed her. The work didn't care about kings or gossip or the terrifying weight of being seen. By midday, the manuscript was whole again. She set it aside to dry and reached for her tea, now cold. The door at the far end of the room opened. A young man in royal livery stepped through, a sealed envelope held before him like an offering. His eyes scanned the room until they found her. Miss Harker, he approached, careful not to touch the documents on her desk. A message for you. Her hands shook as she broke the seal. I would speak with you again if you are willing. The Enclave Gardens, tomorrow evening at sunset. Come alone if you dare. Damon. The choice sat in her palm like a burning coal, stay safe in her small life or cross a threshold that could not be uncrossed. The private entrance led through a narrow stone corridor, the walls cool against Serafina's palms. She emerged into golden light and climbing ivy, the scent of roses wrapping around her like a second skin. The garden stole her breath. Stone arches framed terraced hedges, and a fountain murmured at the garden's heart. She walked the gravel path, her simple wool dress feeling both like armor and a declaration she would not perform. Damon waited by the fountain, his formal robes exchanged for a simple dark coat. The late afternoon light caught the gold flecks in his eyes as he turned toward her. "I've thought of little else since Colère." His voice carried no pretense. "Your mind, Serafina. The way you speak of stories as if they are living things. I want to know more. I want you to know that what you saw in me yesterday, the man, not the crown, is real." Her heart beat at a dangerous rhythm. She stopped a few feet away, arms crossed against the chill of vulnerability. "Why me?" The question came out sharper than she intended. "There must be 1,000 women of appropriate station who would weary."
I have met 1,000 women of appropriate station.
He stepped closer, not invading her space, but closing the distance with intention. "I am meeting you because you matter to me in a way that has nothing to do with bloodline or expectation. That is precisely why it terrifies you, and why I cannot let you walk away." The words landed somewhere deep, in the chamber she'd thought sealed. He extended his hand, not demanding, simply offering. After a moment that stretched like a held breath, she placed her fingers against his palm. His hand was warm, calloused in ways she hadn't expected from a king. He led her deeper into the enclave, to a small archive room tucked against the palace wall. Shelves rose around them, manuscripts stacked and sorted with evident care. Some looked ancient, their pages fragmentary, preserved behind glass. "These are the oldest texts in the kingdom." Damon's voice dropped, reverent. "I have kept them separate because I trust few with their stewardship. I want you to help me restore them. I want you here not as a visitor, but as someone essential." Serafina ran her fingers along the leather spine, the leather cracked with age. This was not conquest. This was not novelty. This was a man offering her the only thing that had ever made her feel whole. "I'll need proper lighting." Her voice came out steadier than her pulse, "and access to the conservatory supplies. These fragments will need whatever you require." A small smile tugged at his mouth. "I'll have my steward deliver the keys." She turned to face him. "You trust me with this. I trust you with everything." They exited the archive together, the evening air softer now, the garden bathed in amber. As they stepped onto the path, Damon's hand found hers again. This time, Serafina held on. The garden seemed to hold its breath around them, roses heavy with scent, the fountain's murmur the only sound between their footsteps. Chapter 2. The Glass Cage. The first afternoon arrived, gray and soft, the spring air carrying hints of rain. Serafina climbed the stone path to the enclave with a satchel of tools against her hip needles, wheat starch, fragments of silk for mending. The guard at the gate nodded her through without question. Damon waited in the archive room, rolled his sleeves to the elbow, a stack of damaged codices waiting on the work table. He looked younger like this, less like a monarch and more like a scholar hungry for answers. "Your Majesty." She inclined her head, the formal address feeling strange on her tongue. "Damon." He pulled a chair beside his. "Here, we are simply two people who care about what these pages have to say." The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, the palace began to expect her. Serafina learned to read the light as it shifted through the high windows, to recognize the particular silence that fell when Damon set aside his crown and spoke as a man. He told her about his tutors, the endless parade of dukes and duchesses paraded before him since boyhood. He described the weight of a crown that isolated even as it elevated. His voice grew quiet when he spoke of his father, a king who had loved duty more than warmth. "And you?" He turned the question gently, as if handling fragile vellum. "Your mother passed 2 years ago. Your father left when you were young." The words sat in her throat. She traced a finger along a cracked spine rather than meet his eyes. She worked herself to exhaustion. 3 jobs, always tired. I found her in the morning just still. Damon said nothing. His presence was steady, offering space rather than pressure. "The scars on my arms," she held them up, the pale marks visible beneath her rolled sleeves. "The fire in the Central Archives 3 years ago. I stayed to save what I could. The heat caught me before I reached the door." "You could have died, I know." Why didn't you run? She considered the question because someone had to save the stories, someone had to remember. His hand covered hers then, warm and deliberate. The pivotal afternoon arrived with amber light and the smell of old paper. Damon brought her a single manuscript, its cover blackened, pages fused together in places. The founding texts, the original laws of the Seven Territories. I found this in the wreckage. His voice carried something like reverence. No one has been able to read it. I thought perhaps you wound. Her hands trembled as she took it. Sections remained from before the fire, from her own cataloging. She read aloud the words of elders who had written not for kings but for people laws, about justice, about counsel, about the responsibility of power. Damon listened. His eyes held an intensity she'd never seen in court, a hunger for something his tutors had never taught him. One evening, as candles burned low and the archive grew cold, he caught her wrist as she packed her tools. Stay. The word was quiet, almost vulnerable. She did. They talked until her voice grew hoarse, until the moon rose high enough to silver the garden through the window. When he finally walked her to the edge, his steps slowed near the stone bench beneath the climbing roses. Serafina. Her name in his mouth sounded like a promise. She turned. He drew her close, his mouth finding hers, gentle but certain, a claiming that spoke of declarations she had never dared to imagine. When she finally left the enclave, the corridors stretched dark and quiet. A figure emerged from the shadows ahead, Lord Varun's secretary, his face pale with recognition, eyes widening as they passed. The secret was out. The summons arrived by royal courier, a cream envelope sealed with the Blackwood crest. Serafina read it twice, her hands steady despite the flutter beneath her ribs. A state breakfast, the High Council and their families. Damon was making a statement. She understood that now, the careful positioning, the public forum. He would not let them pretend she did not exist. The great hall stretched vast and cold beneath the morning light, harsh through windows that rose 3 stories high. Serafina walked the length of the marble floor, her plain gray gown feeling insufficient against the silk and fur of the assembled nobility. Whispers followed her passage, soft as paper tearing. Counselor Lucien Marr rose from his seat as she approached, his smile genuine beneath the measured eyes. Miss Harker, please, sit here beside me. She took the chair he offered, grateful for the buffer between herself and the empty seat to her right. Lord Varun's chair. The counselors filed in, their conversations pausing as they passed her, resumes flickering with surprise or disapproval. She kept her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap. Varun arrived late. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, the measured clip of authority, the rustle of expensive fabric. He took his seat without greeting her, his gaze sliding past as though she were furniture. Your Majesty. His voice carried across the table, silk over steel. I trust the Enclave restoration proceeds with proper archival oversight. One wishes to ensure that precious manuscripts remain in capable hands. The words landed like a slap, though his tone remained pleasant. Capable hands. The doubt was clear. Damon's response came without hesitation. The Enclave restoration is proceeding excellently. Serafina Elwyn Harker has expertise in preservation that equals or exceeds many in the kingdom. She is here as a valued advisor and collaborator. Silence. Then Lucian murmured approval, and others shifted in their seats. But Serafina felt Varun's eyes return to her again and again throughout the meal, measuring, dismissive, calculating. She caught fragments of whisper from down the table. Librarian, below his station. What is he thinking? The words stuck in her throat like bone. After the meal, Damon drew her into a private corridor, his hand warm around her wrist. The stone walls absorbed sound, leaving them isolated. Varun and his faction will move against this. His voice was low, urgent, against us. They see you as a threat to tradition and hierarchy. You need to understand what comes next will not be gentle. She stopped walking. Do you regret it? Bringing me into this? His answer came swift and certain. I regret only that I did not do it sooner. This is not about defying tradition for its own sake. It is about refusing to accept that lineage determines worth. You are worth fighting for, Serafina. I will fight for you. The words should have comforted her. Instead, they settled like stones in her stomach. That evening, Nessa appeared at her door, her face tight with worry. She stepped inside without greeting, her hands clutching a small cloth bag. Rumors are spreading, Nessa said, about the king's mysterious companion. People are saying you seduced him for advancement, that you trapped him through witchcraft or sexual wiles. They're angry, Sarah. They feel the natural order is being violated. Serafina sat on the edge of her bed, the room suddenly too small. She had known this would come, the visibility, the judgment, but hearing it from Nessa's lips made it real. She was no longer a person, she was a symbol, a threat, a vessel for everyone else's fear. And she understood with cold clarity what that meant. The courier arrived 3 days after the state breakfast. Serafina packed her belongings in the small apartment near the archives, a task that took less than an hour. Her clothes, her mother's teacup, a handful of letters, the rest was books, and books belonged to the archive now. Damon sent a carriage. She rode through the castle gates as dusk settled over the moors, the ancient stones turning amber in the failing light. Her new rooms adjoined his, a suite of pale chambers with tall windows overlooking the inner courtyard. The bed was soft, the wardrobe stocked with gowns and colors she did not choose. A handmaiden arrived to help her dress for dinner. "You're to attend His Majesty in the private dining hall," the woman said, her hands efficient and distant. That first night, Serafina walked the castle corridors alone. The passages twisted and turned, branching into wings she had never seen. Servants nodded as she passed, but she caught the sideways glances, the quick assessments, the whispered exchanges, eyes everywhere, loyalty she could not map. She found the library by accident, a door half hidden behind a tapestry. The room stretched long and shadowed, shelves climbing to a vaulted ceiling. She wandered the aisles, fingers trailing spines, until she reached a locked cabinet at the far end. The journals were old, their pages brittle. Queens of the realm, their names inscribed in faded ink. She pulled one free and read by moonlight streaming through glass. Year 17 of my reign. The king has taken a new mistress. I am relieved, though I shall never show it. My son is safe with the alliance to the north. My purpose is fulfilled. She read another. And another. The women wrote of duty, of children born to seal treaties, of influence wielded from the shadows. They wrote of performing the role of queen while remaining strangers to their own lives. They wrote of loneliness dressed in velvet. Serafina closed the last journal. Her hands trembled. That evening she found Damon alone in his chambers, papers scattered before him. He looked up, and something in her face made him rise. "You've been gone all day," he said. "I found the library." He understood without further explanation. His arm drew her close and she let herself be held. "What if you change your mind?" The words came out smaller than she intended. "What if the pressure becomes too great and you decide I was a mistake?" Damon's hand stilled on her hair. Then he tilted her chin up, his whiskey eyes steady. "I cannot promise the political tide will not turn against us, but I can promise my choice is made." "You are not a mistake, Serafina. You are the first true choice I have made as king, a choice based on what I value rather than what duty demands. If I abandon that now, I abandon myself." She wanted to believe him. The question was whether belief would be enough. Counselor Lucien Marr sought her out in the archive weeks later, his presence a quiet interruption in her work. "Walk with me," he said, and they moved through the stacks together. "You are aware that you have become a matter of faction. Lord Varun leads those who see you as an aberration, a commoner who must be removed. Others, myself included, believe your presence may mark the beginning of necessary change. The king has never acted like this before. It has given many of us hope." Serafina absorbed this. "What do you suggest?" "Lord Varun will strike at you publicly. He will attempt to humiliate you, to force the king to choose between you and stability. Your only defense is to refuse to be humiliated. Show the court that you belong here not through birth but through character and competence. That will terrify him more than anything else." She stopped walking. "I am a symbol now." "Yes." Lucian's voice carried no judgment. "The question is, what kind?" The corridor stretched ahead, the castle's ancient stones silent around her. The corridors outside the great hall swallowed them in shadow. Torches flickered along stone walls, casting dancing light across Serafina's trembling hands. "You didn't have to do that," Damon said, his voice low. "I would have handled Varun." "You did handle him." She kept walking, her slippers clicking against marble. "But I needed to speak for myself. I've spent my whole life being spoken about, spoken for, spoken around. I won't start now by letting someone else fight my battles." Damon's hand found her elbow, steadying her as they turned a corner. The press of royal guards fell behind them, respectful distance that felt like isolation. That was brilliant, he said. What you said about truth and bloodline, the entire hall heard you. Most of them probably hated it, some, but not all. He paused at a window overlooking the moonlit courtyard. Lucian was nodding. I've never seen him do that in public. Serafina leaned against the cold stone, the adrenaline still buzzing beneath her skin. Her gown felt too tight, the silk suddenly suffocating. He'll call the vote, you know. Varun, let him. You don't know how the council will fall. You've seen the numbers. I've seen enough to know which men value power over principle. Damon's jaw tightened. But you're right, I can't guarantee outcome. A servant appeared at the far end of the corridor, bearing a folded note. The man approached cautiously, as if expecting to be struck. For you, your majesty. Urgent. Damon broke the seal, his eyes scanning the page. Something shifted in his expression, not anger, but a weary recognition. Varun's secretary, he said, the vote has already been called. Tomorrow morning, Serafina absorbed this, 24 hours, perhaps less, then we should prepare. She straightened, the trembling in her hands settling into resolve. I need to see the council records, any documentation of past no-confidence proceedings, the legal arguments used on both sides. If we're going to fight this, I want to understand the weapon they're aiming at us. Damon studied her, that whiskey gaze unreadable. You could walk away, no one would blame you. Everyone would blame me. And I'd blame myself. She met his eyes directly. I've spent my whole life running from things that scared me. I'm tired of running. She moved past him toward the archive wing, her gray silk trailing behind her like smoke. The guards fell into step, but she barely noticed. There would be time tomorrow to feel the fear, to question whether she'd overstepped, whether her words had been too bold or not bold enough. Tonight, there was work to do. The summons came at dusk, delivered by a guard in Damon's personal livery. Councillor Lucien Marr was to attend the king in his private chambers. Alone, Lucien found Damon standing by the hearth, Serafina seated in a wing-backed chair near the window. The councillor's eyebrows rose slightly at her presence, but his face remained composed. You asked me to come, Lucien said. I'm here. Damon gestured to a seat. I want you to hear this from both of us. The fire crackled as Lucien settled into the chair, his gaze moving between them with the measured assessment of a man who had survived 3 kings. I'm considering restructuring the council, Damon said without preamble. Merit-based advancement, not birthright alone. And I'm considering marriage formal acknowledgement that my choice of partner is my own, not subject to council approval. Lucien's fingers drummed against the armrest. You've just handed Varun his ammunition, I know. You must ensure the reformers are unified. Varun will sway the moderates with arguments about stability and tradition. If you lose even 3 council votes, he can block the marriage through technicality. That's why I need you, Damon said. Not as an advisor, as an architect. The word hung in the air. Lucien studied the king, then Serafina, then the fire again. I'll need to meet with the sympathetic counselors personally, frame Serafina's integration as pragmatic rather than romantic. Her knowledge attracts scholars, her presence signals a new era of merit-based advancement. He paused. It can work, but only if we're meticulous. The following week blurred into candlelit nights and cold tea. Serafina worked in the archive wing, her hands gentle on ancient vellum as she catalogued documents that spoke to the kingdom's founding principles texts, showing the original council chosen for wisdom, not bloodline. She shared her findings with Lucien, with sympathetic counselors, building a historical foundation for Damon's reforms. The work felt different now, not preservation for its own sake, but preservation as weapon. They're listening, Lucien told her one evening. More than I expected, but Varun knows we're moving. He's accelerating. The tower room surprised Serafina. Damon led her through winding stairs, past locked doors, until they emerged onto a narrow balcony overlooking the kingdom. Stars scattered across the sky like scattered light. I am about to make a choice that will divide the realm, Damon said. Some will see it as visionary, others will see it as heresy. But I cannot rule authentically without you beside me. I cannot pretend lineage matters more than character when every moment with you proves otherwise. He took her hands in his. I want to marry you, Serafina. Not to appease scandal or legitimize our relationship, but because you are the partner I choose to build this kingdom's future with. Are you willing? She looked out at the kingdom below, the lights of villages, the dark ribbon of roads, the sprawling lands that would soon call her queen. The weight of it settled into her bones. Yes, she said, I understand what this means. I'm not running from it. His arms came around her, and she let herself lean into him, feeling the certainty that had been building for weeks crystallize into something unshakable. Below them, the kingdom waited. The morning light cut through the stone windows like a blade. Seraphina stood at the back of the chamber, her hands folded beneath the sleeves of a simple gray gown, watching the faces of the High Council as Damon spoke. He did not soften the words. He stated his intention plainly: marriage to Seraphina Elowen Harker and constitutional reforms establishing merit-based advancement within the council structure. The reaction erupted like a held breath finally released. Voices overlapped, counselors shifted in their seats, and Lord Varun rose from his chair, silver hair gleaming in the harsh light, and demanded a formal vote on whether the marriage could proceed without council approval. The debate spiraled. Conservative voices backed Varun Lucian, and his allies argued for the king's prerogative. Seraphina watched the numbers accumulate in her mind: 13 supporting, 9 opposing. Technically, Damon had secured approval, but the division carved through the chamber like a wound. Varun's face flushed as he stood and addressed the king directly. His words cut: the woman had bewitched him, abandoned his duty, would prove unable to bear queenship. He demanded Damon's resignation or restrictions on Seraphina's authority that would render her powerless. The chamber fell silent. Damon's response came swift and absolute. Lord Varun, your service to this kingdom is hereby terminated. Yields to Seraphina Elowen Harker and constitutional reforms establishing merit-based advancement within the council structure. The reaction erupted like a held breath finally released. Voices overlapped, counselors shifted in their seats, and Lord Varun rose from his chair, silver hair gleaming in the harsh light, and demanded a formal vote on whether the marriage could proceed without council approval. The debate spiraled. Conservative voices backed Varun Lucian, and his allies argued for the king's prerogative. Seraphina watched the numbers accumulate in her mind: 13 supporting, 9 opposing. Technically, Damon had secured approval, but the division carved through the chamber like a wound. Varun's face flushed as he stood and addressed the king directly. You will resign from the High Council immediately, or I will exercise my royal authority to remove you. You have until sunset to decide. Veron's body went rigid, his gaze found Seraphina, carrying venom that made her spine straighten despite the cold spreading through her chest. This is not over, your majesty. You will regret this choice. He left. The doors echoed shut behind him. By evening, rumors flooded the capital. The king had banished his oldest advisor. Seraphina Elowen Harker had corrupted the crown. The kingdom teetered on the edge of ruin. That night, torches bloomed in the courtyard below. Conservative nobles and their retainers surged toward the palace gates, shouting for Damon's abdication. The royal guard formed a wall of steel and resolve, repelling the advance without bloodshed. But the message landed clearly: some would not accept this new order without struggle. Seraphina watched from a high window as the crowd dispersed into the darkness. Her reflection stared back from the glass, overlaid with the distant glow of torchlight. They would riot over her. Thousands of voices, willing to fight against her existence. The old fear surfaced, that voice whispering she would be abandoned, destroyed, but it had transformed. It was no longer merely personal anxiety. Her choice had consequences. Real people, real livelihoods hung in the balance because she had said yes. She pressed her palm against the cold stone and breathed. The war room smelled of old stone and candle wax. Damon stood over a table spread with maps, his fingers tracing routes through the capital, while Lucian detailed guard positions. 12 points along the outer wall, Lucian said, marking them with small iron figures. Your most loyal men at the gates and the ceremonial halls. If Varun's people attempt anything during the ceremonial, they'll find us ready. Damon straightened. The commanders, 3 of 4 have pledged. Lord Heron remains uncertain, but I've spoken with his wife. She sees the merit in reform. Good, Damon's jaw tightened. I won't shed noble blood unless they give me no choice. Across the castle, Seraphina sat in her chambers with a stack of parchment, ink drying on her fingers. Nessa paced behind her, offering suggestions and shooting down others. Too defensive, Nessa said, reading over Seraphina's shoulder. You're not apologizing for existing? I'm not. Seraphina set down her quill. You're laying out a vision. Speak to what the kingdom could become, not what you're not. Seraphina reread her words. The speech would define her before the court, before the realm. Every sentence carried weight. She added a line about merit over birth, about truth preserved across generations. Later, in Damon's private study, they spoke of darker matters. If Varun sends an assassin, Seraphina said, I'll have guards know, if he succeeds. She held Damon's gaze. What happens to the reforms? He was silent for a long moment. They die with me. Or they survive through you.
Through what we've built. Then we make sure that doesn't happen.
Lucien's knock came near midnight. He entered with a grim expression, a letter crumpled in his fist. Varun's gone to the Eastern Territories, he said. He's convening dissident nobles. There are already whispers of secession, of recognizing a different heir. The room went cold. How serious? Damon asked. Serious enough that we need to prepare for civil war. The night before the wedding, Seraphina returned to the archive. She walked between the shelves, fingertips brushing leather spines, feeling the weight of centuries in her hands. The manuscripts she had restored stood sentinel on their shelves, testaments to survival, to endurance against those who sought to silence truth. She drew strength from them. By evening, she found Damon in the Enclave Gardens. The fountain murmured. Stars pricked through the darkness above. They sat together on the stone bench where everything had begun. I'm frightened, she admitted. So am I. He took her hand. Not of Varun. Of failing you. Of failing everyone who believes this can work. We don't know if it will. No. He turned to face her. But I know I choose you. I choose this vision. Not because it's safe, but because it's right. She leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his presence, the steadiness that had carried her this far. Then we face it together, she said. Whatever comes. They sat in the garden as the night deepened, two figures against the stars, bound not by tradition, but by choice. Chapter 3. The Visible Crown. The great hall blazed with golden afternoon light as Seraphina stepped through its massive doors. Every eye turned. Whispers rippled through the assembled nobility as they took in her gown white silk embroidered with scenes from the ancient texts, the very manuscripts she had spent months restoring. The embroidery told stories, a queen with open scrolls, common folk before a just court, the founding laws rendered in golden thread across her bodice. She was not hiding what she was announcing it. Damon waited at the altar, his dark coat immaculate, his whiskey gold eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her pulse steady. She passed the assembled lords and ladies of the seven territories, the foreign dignitaries in their strange finery, and the knights and servants packed along the walls. Near the front, a cluster of conservative nobles sat rigid in their seats. At their center, Lord Varun stared forward, his angular face carved from cold stone. His eyes found hers as she passed. The hatred in them was palpable, but so was its impotence. He had been stripped of his council seat. His voice carried no institutional weight anymore. He was a remnant, watching his world end. The high priest began the ceremony in the old tongue, but his words shifted as he spoke of marriage, not as alliance or duty, but as partnership. When it came time for Damon to speak, his voice carried through the hall without hesitation. I choose Seraphina Elowen Harker not because she is of noble birth, not because she brings territory or alliance, but because she is the wisest, bravest, truest person I know. He held her hands as he spoke. In choosing her, I choose a vision of the kingdom where merit and character matter more than bloodline. I choose love over duty's inertia. Seraphina felt the words settle over the assembled court like a challenge. She saw some faces harden, others leaned forward, listening. She spoke her own vows. I choose to stand beside Damon Blackwood, not because he is king, but because he is a man of principle, willing to risk everything for what is just. I choose to use whatever influence and knowledge I possess to help reshape this kingdom into a place where all voices are honored, all stories are preserved, and where power is tempered by mercy. I choose to be a true partner in this work, and I commit to bearing the weight of that partnership with integrity. The high priest blessed them. The hall waited. Then Seraphina rose. The murmur that passed through the crowd was immediate. This was unprecedented, a bride speaking politically at her own wedding. Damon had cleared it with the ceremony's coordinators, but the court had not expected it. She faced the assembled nobility and dignitaries, and she spoke for 10 minutes. She laid out her vision: merit-based council selection, an institutional archive preserving common people's stories, educational access regardless of birth. She spoke of reform not as destruction of the old order, but as its fulfillment, returning to the founding laws that had always promised justice, that had been corrupted by centuries of privilege. When she finished, the silence held for a heartbeat. Then applause broke from the far benches: reformers, common-born attendants, foreign dignitaries who had no stake in the old hierarchies. Others sat in stunned silence, recalculating what this marriage meant. Varun's face darkened, his hands gripped the arms of his chair, but guards positioned throughout the hall prevented any disruption. He was powerless. The ceremony concluded. Damon took Seraphina's hand and they processed out of the great hall as husband and wife, the crowd parting before them, the symbolic threshold crossed. That evening, while celebrations continued in the palace halls, Seraphina and Damon slipped away to the Enclave one final time before their honeymoon journey through the territories. In the candlelit archive, surrounded by the manuscripts they had restored together, they held each other in the quiet that followed triumph. The marriage was complete. But both knew the real work was just beginning. Seraphina woke gasping, the sheets damp against her skin, the nightmare still clung to her, Varun's face twisted in triumph, rioters flooding the capital streets, ordinary families fleeing their homes because the reforms had unraveled faster than anyone predicted. She pressed her palms against her eyes and willed her heart to slow. Damon slept beside her, his breathing even, his face turned away. 3 weeks of marriage, and already the distance between them had grown like a crack in stone. She rose quietly and slipped into the castle corridors, her bare feet silent on cold stone. The library welcomed her with its familiar darkness, rows of shelves dissolving into shadow. She did not light a candle. She simply sat in a chair by the window and stared at the moon. Morning brought servants with tea and apologetic faces. They delivered the news in fragments. The conservative faction had begun circulating pamphlets claiming Seraphina had bewitched the king through dark arts. 3 separate nobles had publicly questioned the merit-based council selections, citing dangerous incompetence in territorial governance. And the Varun had ridden east to ally with the Duke of Thornwall and 2 other powerful lords. They were refusing to recognize the new council. They were talking secession. Seraphina listened in silence. When the servants left, she sat very still. Damon had not come to her chambers in 5 days. He sent notes, brief, affectionate, but always ending with some variation of more work to do or another meeting. The weight of the kingdom pressed down on him, and she could see him disappearing into it, becoming less a man and more a monument to duty. That afternoon, Lucien found her in the archive wing. "The council is wavering," he said without preamble. He stood near the door, as though ready to leave at any moment. "Some believe the marriage has cost too much. They whisper that you should withdraw from public life. Remain a companion, not a queen. It would ease the pressure on Damon." The words landed like a blade. Remain in the shadows, be invisible again. This time by command. She thanked Lucien calmly. He left. That evening, she found Damon in his war room, maps spread across the table, Lucien at his shoulder. They stopped speaking when she entered. "I need to speak with you," she said. Damon's jaw tightened. "Can it wait?" "The Eastern Territories, it cannot wait." Lucien excused himself. The door closed. Damon turned to face her, and she saw exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. But there was something else: irritation, barely contained. "I am trying to hold the kingdom together," he said, his voice sharp. "I am trying to make good on the promises I made to you. I cannot do both and manage every crisis that arises from your presence. Varun has created a genuine threat. I must address it as king, not merely as a man in love." The words hung between them. Not a suggestion that she withdraw, but an accusation that her existence was the problem. Seraphina said nothing. She turned and left. Before dawn, she returned to the archive. The Queen journals waited where she had left them, their pages soft with age. She pulled one from the shelf and read by the gray light seeping through the windows. The words were familiar now. Visibility without voice, presence without partnership, a slow fading into ceremonial irrelevance while the real work of ruling happened elsewhere. She closed the journal. She would not fade. She would not be erased. And if Damon could not support her reclamation of true agency, then she would step back entirely. The cost of love could not be the cost of self. The summons arrived before Serafina had finished her morning tea. An emergency session, the entire council, military commanders from the Eastern Territories, every noble whose loyalty mattered. She dressed quickly, choosing the gray gown she'd worn to the state breakfast months ago, the one that made her feel like a fraud. Today, she buttoned it with steady hands. The great hall swallowed her as she entered. Midday light cut through the high windows in harsh columns, illuminating dust motes and the sea of faces turned toward her. Damon stood at the head of the council table, maps and documents spread before him. Lucian perched at the far end, his expression unreadable. She took her seat beside him. No one had assigned her a place, but the chair remained, and she understood its presence was now a test. Damon's voice carried across the hall. The Eastern Territories have formally declared their intent to secede unless reforms are suspended. Lord Varun and his allies control 3 of the 7. We face the very real possibility of civil war. The silence that followed was absolute. I have consulted with commanders and counselors. The path forward requires compromise. He paused, and Serafina felt the shift in the room, the collective exhale of nobles who had feared exactly this. Reforms will be implemented gradually, over years, not months. Several council appointments will be reconsidered. We will elevate moderates to balance the new structure. The words landed like stones. Serafina watched Damon's face, searching for the man she'd married beneath the crown. He did not look at her. I understand this is not what many of you hoped for, he continued, but unity is essential. We cannot request the floor. The words left her mouth before she'd consciously decided to speak them. Heads turned. Lucian's hand tightened on his quill. Damon's gaze snapped to her, his expression flickering between alarm and something harder. This is highly irregular, a senior counselor muttered. Serafina. Damon's voice carried a warning. She rose. Her legs trembled, but her voice held steady. I understand that my presence has created instability. Lord Varan and his allies have argued that my integration into the court has weakened the kingdom, that a return to pure lineage-based governance would restore order. She paused, letting the words settle. I am here to tell you that they are partially correct. My presence has disrupted the old order. But disruption is not damage. Disruption is the price of justice. The hall shifted. She felt their attention pivot from dismissal to something more dangerous: engagement. For centuries, this kingdom has operated on the principle that birth determines worth. The consequence is that genius is wasted because it is born to common people. Leadership is mediocre because it is inherited rather than earned. The realm staggers because half its population is invisible, their gifts untapped. She turned to face Damon directly. Varun's faction fears reform, not because it is unjust, but because it threatens their monopoly on power. Your Majesty, I know that you are prepared to slow reform to preserve unity. I understand the temptation of that choice, but I will not be the reason the kingdom retreats from justice. If you choose compromise, then I choose to step back. I will not be the justification for eroding the very principles that our marriage was meant to represent. Damon rose slowly. His face was a battlefield: anger, love, frustration, and something else moving through his features like dawn breaking over water. Serafina, you cannot ask me to choose between you and the stability of the realm. That is an impossible choice. No. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. I am not asking you to choose between me and stability. I am asking you to choose between genuine reform and false compromise. I am asking you to choose between the vision you articulated when you married me and the fear that the traditionalists have engineered. I am asking you to be the king you promised to be. The silence stretched. Every face in the hall remained frozen, waiting. Damon stepped forward. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. I will not retreat from reform, not because I am certain it will succeed, but because retreat would mean accepting that the old order, the system that claims birth matters more than character, is legitimate. It is not. Serafina is right. We will implement the reforms as planned. We will stand firm against secession, and we will trust that a kingdom built on justice is stronger than one built on fear. He turned to the assembled nobles, his gaze sweeping across the conservative faction. You have a choice. Accept the new order and participate in shaping it toward stability, or leave the realm, but understand that the seven territories will no longer operate under the principle of pure lineage supremacy. That era is ending. I am ending it. Varun rose from his seat, his face purpled with fury. You are making a catastrophic mistake, Your Majesty, and when this realm crumbles, you will understand that you destroyed it not for principle but for a woman. History will judge your choice harshly. History will judge my choice based on the consequences. Damon's voice was ice. If the kingdom flourishes because merit-based governance attracts talented leaders and honors all people's contributions, then history will vindicate me. If I retreat from justice to appease fear, history will rightly condemn me. I choose to gamble on justice, Lord Varun. I choose to stand beside a partner who has taught me that standing is harder and more important than sitting. Lucian rose. In a formal gesture that surprised many, he bowed to Seraphina deep, deliberate, unmistakable. A moment later, another counselor followed. Then another. Within moments, more than half the council had bowed. Varun watched, his expression cold fury personified. He stood, said nothing, and walked from the great hall. Three conservative nobles followed. The rest remained seated, their faces ranging from resigned acceptance to cautious hope. As the session concluded, Damon reached for Seraphina's hand. The gesture was not romantic but political, a public acknowledgement that she was his equal partner in the work ahead. The morning light filtered through the ivy-covered arches of the enclave, casting dancing shadows across the restored manuscript spread across the work table. Seraphina's fingers moved carefully over fragile parchment, her mending brush precise while Damon read aloud from a neighboring text, his voice steady and engaged. You've made this room famous, Damon said, setting the manuscript aside. Counselor Thornton asked specifically to visit the archive during the spring session. He claims he's developed an interest in preservation. Seraphina smiled slightly. His interest extends to the new educational mandates, I suspect. He wants to ensure his family's investments are protected. He's learning to adapt. That's what victory looks like. Not destruction of enemies, but transformation of skeptics. The door to the archive room opened, and Counselor Lucien Marr entered, his expression carrying the particular weight that Seraphina had learned to recognize as significant news. He carried a leather folder and the careful posture of a man delivering substantive updates. The Eastern Territories have sent their first formal delegation, Lucien said, placing the folder on the table. Lord Hartwell will arrive within the week to negotiate reintegration. Varun's coalition has fractured 3 of the 5 territories that threatened secession have already accepted the new governance structure. Damon nodded slowly. And the remaining 2. They're stalling. They want guarantees about land rights and noble privileges that the council cannot in good conscience grant. But they're negotiating. That's different from where we stood a month ago. Seraphina examined the documents Lucien had brought, her archivist's eye catching details that others might miss. They want time to save face. Give them a framework that allows them to return without appearing to surrender. Lucien inclined his head, a flicker of approval crossing his features. I'll draft something with that approach. Over the following weeks, the reforms took institutional shape. The council formally enacted merit-based selection for lower administrative positions. The Royal Treasury allocated funds for expanded educational access across the outer territories. And in a ceremony that made Seraphina's chest tighten with unexpected emotion, Nessa stood before the assembled court as the newly appointed director of the expanded archive program. I came to these archives as a girl of 16, Nessa said, her voice carrying clearly through the great hall. With ink-stained fingers and no family name to open doors. I stayed because I believed that every story mattered, not just the ones born into privilege. Today, this kingdom has chosen to honor that belief. Seraphina watched from her place beside the throne, seeing the way Nessa's gaze swept across the assembled nobles without wavering. When their eyes met, something passed between them, years of shared labor, mutual protection, and the quiet courage that had carried them both from invisible labor to visible purpose. That evening, Seraphina found Damon in the highest tower of Thorn Hollow Castle, standing at the window that overlooked the 7 territories. The spring air carried the scent of growth, and far below the kingdom spread out in patches of light and shadow. The Eastern Territories will return within the month, she said, joining him at the window. Lucian's delegation reports that even the hardliners are accepting the inevitable. They're accepting the reality. Whether they accept the principle is another matter. Damon's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining as they had in the same spot months earlier. What do you see when you look at the kingdom? Serafina was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving across the landscape she had once believed she would never matter to. I see a realm still learning what it means to be just. I see people who fought the old order and people who are grieving it. I see possibility, not certainty. She turned to face him. But I see it. That is what matters. Damon pulled her close, his hand resting over her heart. You have changed me, Serafina. Not by seducing me into irresponsibility, as Varun feared, but by teaching me that a kingdom ruled with love is stronger than one ruled with fear. I would have spent my reign managing tradition without questioning it. You gave me permission to ask whether tradition served justice or merely preserved privilege. And you gave me something I thought I would never have: visibility, voice, partnership. Her hand covered his. You chose to see me when it would have been easier to remain blind to the cost of the old order, that choosing is what matters. They stood together as the sun rose over the seven territories, the light catching the stone of Thornhollow Castle and making it luminous. Below them, the kingdom woke. It was still fractured in some ways, still resistant to change in others, but it had been irrevocably altered. Years passed, and the grand state occasions gave way to quieter moments. Serafina and Damon worked together in the archive, consulting on decisions that shaped the kingdom's policy. They walked through the gardens where they had first begun to trust each other, their voices low as they discussed the challenges of governing well. They sat in council meetings where their partnership was no longer novel but foundational, the model for how power could be shared, how authority could be tempered by love without losing its clarity or strength. Nessa, now a high official in the royal household, met with Serafina privately in the archive wing one afternoon. Her expression carried the particular excitement that Serafina had learned to recognize as significant discovery. The expanded program has led to something remarkable, Nessa said, spreading documents across the table. Historical texts that prove the kingdom's founding principles were always meant to be more egalitarian than centuries of lineage had compressed them into. The original charters speak of merit, of service, of governance that serves all people, not merely those born to privilege. Serafina examined the documents, her archivist's eye confirming what Nessa had found. The truth had been waiting, preserved in the very archives she had devoted her life to protecting. You were right, Nessa told her friend, a smile spreading across her face. The truth was always there, waiting to be restored. Just like you. The conflict was not ended. Varan and the traditionalists remained, voices of resistance and caution, maintaining their principles even as they no longer controlled the narrative. But the nature of that conflict had transformed. The kingdom had chosen a different future, not perfect, but more just. And that choosing was made possible by one woman who refused to be invisible, who stood firm when standing was dangerous, and who trusted that her voice, combined with a king's courage, could reshape the world.